No privacy, no dignity, and an endless supply of chamber pots. Welcome to life as a lady-in-waiting at Versailles, where your entire existence revolves around watching someone else be important while you quietly suffer behind the scenes. Picture this. It's 1682. King Louis XIV has transformed a hunting lodge into the most magnificent palace in Europe. The Sun King shines, the nobles orbit him like planets, and you're basically celestial dust. A lady-in-waiting at Versailles, technically an honor, practically a prison sentence with better outfits. Meet Claudine Valois, daughter of minor nobility, who arrived at Versailles with dreams of glamour and royal connections. What she got instead was a life of perpetual standing, waiting, and occasionally holding a basin while her mistress vomited after too much rich food at dinner. My first day, I was so excited, Claudine would later write in her secret diary. By evening, my feet had swollen to twice their size, my corset had bruised my ribs, and I'd been sneezed on by 3 duchesses, all while never being permitted to sit down. And that was considered a good day. Ladies-in-waiting at Versailles weren't just companions. They were human furniture with heartbeats. The position was technically unpaid, though many considered the opportunity payment enough. Families would bankrupt themselves buying the required wardrobes just to place their daughters in the Queen's household, hoping for advantageous marriages or court connections. The irony? Most ladies-in-waiting were already married, often to men they barely knew and rarely saw, since their duties kept them perpetually at court. "My husband sent me a letter last week," Claudine confided to her colleague Giselle, another lady-in-waiting. "I think he addressed me as Madame, because he's forgotten my actual name." Giselle nodded sympathetically. "Mine asked if I could bring home some of the Queen's leftover desserts. I haven't seen him in 8 months." The daily routine was absurdly regimented. Ladies-in-waiting rose before dawn to prepare themselves, then immediately began preparing their mistress. The morning ritual or toilette could take hours, with ladies standing ready to hand over pins, powder, perfumes, or whatever else might be needed. Meanwhile, their own bodily needs were to be ignored until granted permission to leave, which might never come. One particularly memorable morning, Claudine stood for 3 hours during the Queen's toilette with a full bladder, smiling pleasantly while contemplating the dignity-to-suffering ratio of simply relieving herself in her many petticoats versus the scandal of requesting a break. "The worst part wasn't even the physical discomfort," she later told Giselle. "It was watching the Queen's spaniel relieving itself on a silk cushion and receiving praise for it while I was crossing my legs so hard I could have cracked walnuts between my thighs." Personal space? At Versailles? Hilarious notion. The palace may have contained 700 rooms, but privacy wasn't included in the architectural plans. Ladies-in-waiting often slept several to a room, sometimes even sharing beds. The Queen's chambers were never empty. Ladies were required to be present day and night, with some even sleeping on pallets on the floor of the royal bedchamber. Court etiquette dictated every movement, breath, and thought. A lady couldn't speak unless spoken to, sit unless invited, or leave without permission. Even breathing too loudly near royalty could result in social disgrace. Meanwhile, gossip was the official palace currency, and everyone was simultaneously investor and investment. "Did you hear about Duchess de Montpensier?" whispered a lady named Bernadette during a rare moment when the Queen was occupied with her confessor. "The one who was caught with the King's footman?" Claudine asked. "No, that's the Countess de Soissons. The Duchess was found with a Protestant book under her pillow." Giselle gasped. "How scandalous! Almost as bad as when you were caught eating chocolate before the Queen had hers." Claudine winced at the memory. 3 weeks of night duty for that. I had to empty the royal chamber pot for 21 consecutive nights. Speaking of bodily functions, ladies-in-waiting were intimately involved with the most personal aspects of their mistress's life. Holding basins for vomit was just the beginning. They assisted with bathing, which, thankfully, occurred rarely in 17th century France, menstruation, pregnancy, childbirth, and toilet needs. The Queen might use an actual toilet, a velvet-covered close stool, while her ladies had to excuse themselves to use chamber pots, often shared with others. During one royal birth, Claudine held the Queen's hand for 18 hours straight, not permitted to eat, drink, or use the facilities herself. When she finally collapsed from exhaustion, she was temporarily dismissed from service as punishment for her weakness. The queen screamed obscenities in Spanish for nearly a day while pushing out a future king, she later remarked. I faint once, and suddenly I'm lacking proper dedication to the crown. Hygiene at Versailles was, to put it delicately, conceptual rather than actual. The palace's 1,200 fountains ran only a few hours a week due to water shortages. Bathing was considered unhealthy and potentially immoral. Instead, people changed their linen shirts and chemises, believing this sufficient for cleanliness. The result? A palace that combined the olfactory delights of stale perfume, body odor, and human waste. Ladies-in-waiting were expected to be walking fragrance diffusers, scented with expensive perfumes to mask the reality that everyone smelled terrible. Their elaborate hairstyles, sometimes towering 2 feet high, could remain unwashed for months, leading to lice infestations that were considered simply part of court life. I found a mouse nest in the Duchess of Burgundy's hair last month, reported Giselle during one rare moment of rest. The hairdresser worked around it rather than disturb the structure. They named the mice. Claudine nodded. The Countess d'Artois has colonies of lice named after enemy nations. She claims France is winning the war in her wig. Food presented another bizarre challenge. Ladies-in-waiting were expected to monitor their appearance rigorously. Too fat was unseemly, too thin suggested consumption or, worse, poverty. Yet they rarely controlled when or what they ate. They might stand for hours watching royals feast, their own stomachs growling, unable to partake unless offered something directly. And if offered, refusing was not an option. The king offered me a sweetmeat yesterday, Claudine told her diary. It was covered in gold leaf. I'm fairly certain I'm now bleeding internally. The physical toll was matched only by the emotional one. Ladies-in-waiting needed to be perpetually pleasant, eternally available, and absolutely discreet, while simultaneously gathering and managing information in the court's complex social ecosystem. They were expected to be witty but not too clever, beautiful but not distractingly so, present but essentially invisible. One winter night, during a particularly frigid spell when the fountains had frozen and windows were sealed with wax against drafts, Claudine stood behind the queen during a 5-hour card game. The room, packed with perfumed bodies and lit by hundreds of candles, became so hot that 3 gentlemen fainted. Ladies, constrained by corsets and etiquette, didn't have the luxury of unconsciousness. I counted 7 women silently weeping from discomfort, Claudine noted. The Marquise de Lafayette's face paint was melting in streaks, making her look like a sad harlequin. When she finally got permission to retire, she left a perfect outline of her face powder on the wall she'd been leaning against for support. Health problems were inevitable and abundant. Chronic back pain, varicose veins, digestive disorders, and respiratory issues plagued ladies-in-waiting. The combination of restrictive clothing, inadequate nutrition, and constant standing created a perfect storm of medical issues that were expected to be endured silently. Pregnancy complicated matters further. Married ladies-in-waiting who became pregnant were often expected to continue their duties until physically unable, then return as soon as possible after delivery, sometimes sending their infants to wet nurses they might not see for years. The Duchess de Bourbon gave birth in an antechamber during the King's levee, Giselle whispered one morning. She muffled her screams with a tapestry swatch and was back pouring the Queen's chocolate the next day. Claudine raised an eyebrow. Impressive. Almost as impressive as Madame de Ventadour, who miscarried during the ballet and tucked the remains into her handkerchief until she could dispose of them during the intermission. Perhaps the cruelest irony was that despite the supposed honor of the position, ladies-in-waiting were often treated with less consideration than the royal dogs. When Claudine accidentally stepped on the tail of the Queen's favorite lapdog, she was banished from court for a week. When the dog bit Claudine's ankle hard enough to draw blood, the animal was rewarded with a silver collar. At least the dog gets to bark when displeased, Claudine wrote bitterly. I have to smile and ask for another bite. After 15 years of service, Claudine had developed a permanent stoop from curtsying, chronic indigestion from irregular meals, and a facial tic from maintaining a pleasant expression through increasingly unpleasant circumstances. When she finally received permission to retire to her husband's estate, she discovered he had remarried, having assumed she had died at court years earlier. "I can't entirely blame him," she told Giselle during their tearful farewell. "I've been dead in all the ways that matter for years. At least now I can sit down while contemplating my existence." Giselle, promoted to First Lady of the Bedchamber after decades of service, nodded sagely. "I've served 3 queens and outlived 2 of them. My reward? I now get to empty a more prestigious chamber pot." And so we bid farewell to the ladies-in-waiting of Versailles, whose lives embodied the grand irony of the French court, gaining the highest honor of proximity to power, only to sacrifice their health, happiness, and humanity in exchange for the privilege of watching someone else live magnificently. They traded comfort for corsets, freedom for formality, and dignity for duty, all while maintaining impeccable posture and perfect smiles. As Claudine herself concluded in the final entry of her diary, "After 30 years at Versailles, I've learned the true meaning of nobility. It's the ability to hold your tongue, your bladder, and your sanity simultaneously while watching monarchs eat cake. Perhaps the real revolution won't come from the streets but from the ladies-in-waiting who finally, collectively, decide to sit down."